So here is a graph, if you're watching the slide version of this webinar, of a normal circadian rhythm. And we're going to really geek out on this stuff and go into it in a little bit more detail, but it helps to see a visualization. So you can see basically this little clock here. It starts, if you start at the bottom there, actually, I'm sorry, don't start at the bottom. Start in the morning, really. That's a good place to start, where you see 6:45 a.m., sharpest rise in blood pressure, 7:30 a.m., melatonin secretion stops, around 8:30, that's when bowel movement and gastric activity becomes more likely. 9 a.m. is your highest point of testosterone secretion. 10 a.m. you get into more of a low alert mode, and then we cycle around to 2:30 a.m., which is where you achieve a peak in coordination. 2:30 p.m., which is where you experience a peak in coordination. Not many of us are super coordinated at 2:30 a.m. 3:30 p.m., fastest reaction time. 5 p.m., the greatest amount of cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength. 6:30 p.m., again, we see a peak in blood pressure. 7 p.m., a peak in body temperature. And then around 10 p.m. or so, we start to see, or 9 p.m., we start to see a secretion of melatonin, and around 11:30 or so, bowel movements are suppressed. Or, I'm sorry, around 10:30 or so, bowel movements are suppressed. And then around midnight, we're asleep. 2 a.m., we reach our deepest sleep phase. 4:30 a.m., we reach our lowest body temperature. So that stuff's not just all magical. There's a hormonal reason and a hormonal milieu that creates that type of scenario. And so what we're going to do now is delve into that exact scenario and what causes it. So we're going to start at 6 a.m. Let me grab a little bit of water here, and then we'll dive into this. Okay, so 6 a.m., here's what happens. You get a surge of cortisol. That surge of cortisol hormone, which you're going to learn more about the surge of cortisol hormone during our discussion of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis during our hormone module. But basically, you get this surge of morning cortisol that literally turns on your brain. And that coincides with something very important. It's called VIP. And VIP stands for vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. That is a type of hormone that causes a lot of really cool stuff to happen. But some of the things that it causes is contractility in your heart, vasodilation or widening of the blood vessels, glycogenolysis, which is a breakdown of your liver's glycogen primarily, and a little bit of muscle glycogen to start to bring blood sugar up. A lowering of the blood pressure, which of course goes hand in hand with that vasodilation, and relaxed smooth muscle of your trachea, your stomach, and your gallbladder. And so a lot of times, this is also why when you wake up, you tend to, for a little while, feel like eating breakfast, because it goes hand in hand with the surge in the hormone ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. I always remember ghrelin because I think about the stomach growling, and that helps me remember that ghrelin is the hormone that can cause you to be hungry. And this is why when that surge of morning cortisol causes the release of vasoactive intestinal polypeptide, as well as the surge of ghrelin hormone, this is why it's important for people who have hormonal resistances. Let's say something like leptin sensitivity. This would be leptin insensitivity. Okay, you find that often in people who are overweight or obese, who have gone through a period of time in their lives when they just churned out way too much leptin from fat cells, so they were overloading. So, this person has leptin resistance. What happens is that if they've got that type of hormonal imbalance, it's going to work better to rebalance them, for them to act in a way that their hormones are driving them to act. So when we get that ghrelin surge in the morning that lasts about an hour, it's important during that time for someone who has a hormonal imbalance to actually eat first thing in the morning, to reset that circadian clock and to start to get their hormones in rhythm. Now, this is also why way back in the fat loss module that I mentioned that people who are in their first few weeks of training, who tend to be hormonally imbalanced, or people who are 30 plus pounds obese or overweight specifically, and most importantly, people who fall into both those camps, first few weeks of training and also obese and overweight, those aren't necessarily the folks that you want to take and have skip breakfast or do fasted workout sessions in the morning if they're going to be missing this window of time, because it can simply keep them from resetting their hormonal imbalances. So that ghrelin surge lasts about an hour in the morning, and that's why it's important, even though it may seem counterintuitive, for someone who's really messed up hormonally to actually eat breakfast in the morning. So about 6:45 a.m., the blood pressure peaks. And that's why high stress in the morning can lead to a morning heart attack. That's why checking your email while drinking a cup of coffee in the morning can cause that surge in blood pressure. Another thing, I've been literally like living during the day with this chest strap on, monitoring my heart rate variability. Another time when my HRV, my variability, surges, indicating a rise in beta brainwaves and stress, is when I combine getting up first thing in the morning, skipping stretching, skipping quiet time, and going straight to my computer with a cup of coffee. That is a surefire way to throw my beta brainwave production through the roof and my heart rate variability through the roof. So notes to self. Okay, so at some point, depending on where you're living and what season it is, we get sunrise, and the light from sunrise is what shuts off melatonin production and also contributes to that surge of morning cortisol, which is why you typically, if you're a coffee drinker, need a little less coffee in the summer than you do in the winter, because light creates a lot of that cortisol that caffeine is artificially creating, in the winter when it's darker out and you wake up. It's also another reason why those sun bright or light bright alarm clocks, why mine sits in my closet until about November every year, and then I take it out because that's when it's dark in my room at the time I would normally like to get up. And so I like that little surge of cortisol that it gives me because, frankly, I don't really like to drink more than about 8 ounces of coffee in the morning. So about 9 to 10 a.m., your sex hormone secretion peaks, which is interesting for a lot of folks. Some of us like to think that it peaks about 9 to 10 p.m. when we're sitting at the bars or hanging out on the couch with our loved one, but it actually peaks in the morning. And so, if you're looking to get a little vibe back into your sex life, or you're having trouble in that area, consider reinventing the way that you think about sex to kind of push it more towards the morning if possible. And a morning quickie can actually be quite pleasurable because of that peak of sex hormone secretion from 9 to 10 a.m. And then about 2:30 p.m., we get a peak in our muscle coordination and our reaction time. And this is very, very interesting. And a lot of people take this to think that this would be the best time of day to exercise. And it's not necessarily the best time of day to exercise, because even though muscle coordination and reaction time peaks around 2:30 p.m., as you can see on this next slide here, at 5 p.m., your cardiovascular efficiency and your protein synthesis peaks. So what that means is that if your cardiovascular efficiency peaks, you're going to do best at that point of the day doing your hardest muscular or cardiovascularly intensive task of the day. And in addition to that, because protein synthesis peaks right around that time as well, it means that the post-workout amino acids that you consume, the post-workout proteins that you consume, are going to be most likely to cause muscle repair and recovery to peak. So whenever I've got the choice, if I have the luxury of choosing during the day, I time my workouts to start around 4-ish, 4:30-ish, and finish up sometime between any time between 5 and 6 really is ideal. And then you can have dinner when that protein synthesis is peaking, and that's actually a really, really good scenario. It's also why I tend to do any easy stuff earlier in the morning and then harder stuff later on in the day in myself and also in the programs that I create for like workout programs for folks. Now, then we have sunset, and sunset is when your blood pressure can peak again and your body temperature can peak again at that point as well. This is also why a cold shower post-afternoon/evening workout can help you get to sleep earlier, because it shunts a little bit of that sharp rise in body temp and heat production around sunset. Now, this is about the time, too, around sunset, that leptin is released from your fat stores. If you are leptin sensitive, if you are not living in a state of constant carbohydrate consumption, if you're not living in a state of inadequate sleep, if you're not living in a state of too much energy intake, you can be leptin sensitive. And so leptin gets released from your fat stores and kind of puts your body into a state where it can begin to transition into using more fatty acids as a fuel, which is a quite convenient thing to do since you can't eat while you are asleep. Now, if leptin sensitivity is not something that someone has, then what happens is at sunset they get appetite cravings, because your leptin production is basically outpaced by ghrelin production. And that's why someone who has appetite cravings at night really needs to focus on resetting their circadian rhythms and restoring that leptin sensitivity so that a lot of those appetite cravings go away. And that's why sleep is so important when it comes to that tie between sleep and appetite control. Now, from sunset until the time you go to bed, leptin continues to rise to help you control your appetite, and adenopectin, which is a special type of hormone that could cause fatty acid metabolism, also tends to rise, and that will rise as insulin falls. So if you've got high levels of constantly circulating insulin from high energy intake, and just about the only thing that's not going to cause that high insulin rise is some good healthy fats like coconut oil or something like that, then what happens is if you have those high levels of insulin, you shut down fatty acid metabolism because you limit that adenopectin release, and you can also limit some of that leptin release. So that's why it's really important to control sunset to bedtime snacking. Now, around 10 p.m. is when melatonin secretion is going to begin. And that is going to assume that up until 10 p.m., from sunset up until 10 p.m., there hasn't been a lot of artificial light exposure. If there's been a lot of artificial light exposure from the time that sun sets up until 10 p.m., we tend to see a real insignificant release or less significant release of melatonin. Now, the other thing that tends to happen right around 10 p.m. is you get a peak of a protein called agouti protein. And agouti protein has the potential to massively stimulate the appetite, similar to the way that ghrelin hormone would stimulate the appetite, unless leptin is there to actually balance that protein. And so you can see how you would set yourself up for a vicious cycle if you're snacking from sunset to bedtime, because you get that rise in insulin from snacking. You get the drop in leptin or the leptin insensitivity from the high circulating levels of insulin, and then that's followed by the inability of leptin to be released. And when leptin isn't there to balance, then you get that peak in agouti protein that can massively stimulate the appetite unless leptin is there to balance it. So around 11 p.m. is when gastrointestinal mobility and kind of your brain-gut connection should begin to quiet down, as long as we've got everything else in place by this point. So we shouldn't be peeing and pooing and experience all of those type of things around 11 p.m. on, unless something is kind of wrong with the circadian rhythm. Okay, now we're going to move forward into about midnight, because midnight is really the peak of melatonin secretion. And it's at that point when melatonin secretion peaks that leptin is going to enter the area of your brain called your hypothalamus. And this is very important, because when leptin enters the hypothalamus, what that causes is a release of your fat reserves. So if you're leptin sensitive, meaning that you're not amping up insulin production in the evening, especially from high consumption of calories and big time high consumption of carbohydrates after bedtime, and if you're not engaging in much nighttime snacking, then leptin will enter the hypothalamus for the release of those fat reserves. And leptin will also at that point signal your thyroid to upregulate thyroid function. Leptin will also induce changes in your mitochondria to help your mitochondria produce heat, because what happens is as you're sleeping, your core temp will begin to fall, and your body has to produce heat. It's not going to produce heat from you running or lifting weights or something like that while you're asleep. So what leptin does is it has this really cool effect in the mitochondria, where it allows your mitochondria, in the same way that brown adipose tissue, BAT tissue, can produce heat, it can also induce changes in your mitochondria that allow your mitochondria to produce heat instead of what your mitochondria would usually produce, which would be ATP, or energy for like your muscles to fire. This is the same way that bears and mammals stay warm when they're hibernating in caves, in the cold caves in the winter. They're leptin sensitive. They get these huge surges of leptin while they're asleep, and that induces the changes in the mitochondria that allow the mitochondria to produce heat instead of ATP. So, it's a hibernation. So every time you sleep, if you're leptin sensitive, you're going into this kind of brief state of hibernation where your body is mobilizing a ton of fat stores. And that's why sleep can help with fat loss.